it is absolutely incredible that economic concepts and tool sets are being implemented, deeply into computational processes and into network security processes. Like, I think this is actually quite a major, quite a big deal, intellectually, technically, philosophically. Yeah, it is quite a big deal. And I first realized this when I went to a Bitcoin conference a while back, and it was really interesting. I was like, wow, here's like, it's basically, cryptographers that are discussing economics.
Cryptographers discussing economics. That's a perfect start for today's episode. Welcome everybody to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and my guest today is Dr. Jaya Klara Brekke, and we will be talking about blockchain technology in relation to the question of the political. You can find Jaya's dissertation on a website at distributingchains.info. It is titled Disassembling the Trust Machine, 3 Cuts on the Political Matter of Blockchain. And if you want to know more about the podcast, please visit futurehistories.today. Most of the episodes will be in German, but once in a while I'll do an interview in English, especially if it allows me to talk to people like Jaya, whose work I highly recommend to everybody interested in the field. Check out Future Histories on Twitter and Reddit and let me know what you think about the show, or write me an email to future_histories@protonmail.com. You can support the show on Patreon. For this, go to patreon.com/futurehistories. But now, enough promo. Please enjoy the interview with Jaya. I certainly did. Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and my guest today is Dr. Jaya Klara Brekke. She's a researcher investigating what matters politically in blockchain technology at Durham University. Welcome, Jaya.
Hi.
I think most of my listeners will have heard of the term blockchain at some point, but I think there's still actually considerable confusion and quite a lot of mysticism around the technology. So let's cover the basics first. What is a blockchain and what types of blockchains are there? Okay,
so the way I tend to explain blockchain is I go back to cryptography, and I go back to starting off with explaining what cryptographic hashing is. For those who are not familiar. So essentially, this is a mathematical process where you take some data, you put it through this process, and it spits out a string of numbers, or a string of numbers and letters, characters, whatever kind of hashing algorithm you're using. And this has a very particular set of characteristics which are extremely useful. Because only the exact same data would spit out that particular string of numbers. So what that means is that if anything in the data changes, you can detect that by running the hashing algorithm again. And if it doesn't spit out the same number, then you know something has been tampered with. So it's a very useful way of verifying the integrity of data. So you add a timestamp to this, and you string this together in a chain of hashed data, and what you essentially potentially have is a linear history of, things that have changed over time, or sets of data over time, and that's essentially the kind of blockchain in terms of kind of data structure. But then there is the question of how do you, if you want to have this taking place in a decentralized network, how does the decentralized network come to an agreement around what data should be added and hashed into this chain in the first place? So how do we come to an agreement about what has happened, in a given context? In the case of Bitcoin, what has happened in terms of transactions? In the case of Ethereum, what has happened in terms of computation? But it could be any potential data. So that consensus mechanism is what's called proof of work in Bitcoin and in many other cryptocurrencies. There are other consensus protocols. I'm going to explain the one that Bitcoin uses. That's the kind of starting point, let's say. But you also have things like proof of stake. You have things like proof of importance and proof of cooperation. But so the way the consensus protocol takes place in Bitcoin is the network competes on grouping together the transactions into blocks and running it through a hashing process that needs to spit out a number that meets certain requirements. If it does not spit out that number meeting certain requirements, then they have not successfully mined a block yet, so they need to try again. And by trying again, they basically just add a nonce, which is a random number, to the data. until the random number that they add to the data affects the output string of number in such a way so that it meets the requirements. So what is it we have here is actually a quite profound shift in understanding around the word consensus and an understanding around how a network reaches consensus. Because if we think about kind of, this as a model for governance, this is a model for agreeing about what actually happened. You have gone from, previous models that could be, a political leader decides what's true or not, a judge decides what's true or not, a religious leader decides what's true or not, or science or some kind of, philosophical kind of understanding of truth of events and so on, to a system which is essentially, the way that it decides what's happened, the way that it's decided what's true is through randomized turns. That is incentivized through rewards. So you have a competition to be the one to define which transactions are considered valid or what data is considered valid for that round. So you have all these, this whole network of computers that are taking turns that are competing with each other to be the next in turn to define the truth for that next block. That is essentially the kind of Bitcoin consensus protocol.
So blockchain technology did have very political goals from the start, and one of them actually being the goal of overcoming politics altogether. How did you approach the question of the political in your work on blockchain technology?
So first of all, it was really kind of working that out, understanding, what's really kind of the underlying ideas that gave rise to this technology. And from that, I articulated this thing that actually, what seems to be happening here is an attempt at a kind of technical fix, a technical solution to the problem of the political. So if we understand the political as basically the negotiation of incompatible differences through lots of different means, that would be one definition. What you have here is a technology that tries to kind of resolve that in some kind of final manner. So, you take the problem of power and authority, that will be replaced by a decentralized network. So problem of authority has been solved. The problem of consensus between, incompatible positions, well, we've got an algorithm that will do that, and an algorithm that will do that in a way that's decentralized, meaning no one can control it, which means that it can be considered somewhat, can be considered neutral. And then we have the problem of how to enforce that and secure the system, and code will enforce it, and cryptography will secure the system from any kind of attacks or manipulation. So the idea is like these components somehow resolve the problem of the political in some kind of final way. So a lot of my work, I guess, was partially kind of untangling where do these ideas come from, and how are they sought to be kind of like written and encoded, and what's that process, what has that process looked like, and also to look at kind of, there's lots of different theories around like understanding the politics of technology. One of them is, really understands the political as something that then gets inscribed into a piece of technology or an infrastructure, so that a certain kind of politics or ethics will be operating in a kind of imminent manner. So, say for example, for me, like a really good example is the door closer that I think Bruno Latour uses, and is one kind of easy way of understanding this principle, which is basically like a door closer will automatically close the door, and that enforces a certain kind of understanding that the door being closed is good, whereas the door remaining open is bad. So therefore we have this door closer that's now going to continue to enforce that, regardless of what we feel about it or not. Of course, the door closer is radically different from a complex network, because a door closer, if you disagree with it, You just kind of like put something to block it from working, or you pick it apart, or whatever else. It's quite easy to change those conditions, and it's also quite easy to see what exactly is enforcing those conditions. Where in complex network technology, sometimes it's pretty hard to understand where and why something turns out the way it turns out, and how to fix that. And it requires certain skills to understand that, and it requires certain skills to tinker with it. Of course, in blockchain and in the kind of open source movement, that problem is attempted to be addressed by actually making things open source and trying to kind of explain systems and involve people in a variety of ways. And that's like, a very positive side of the culture. But I think I lost my thread there a little bit.
Oh, don't mind. It's it's good because you pointed towards you looking at the history of network cultures, actually, in order to understand how this, you call it blockchain sensibility, got formed the way it is, And I think you did a very good job in pointing out that we should definitely take a second look, and that both the evangelists, like the blockchain evangelists, should like get away from easy dichotomies, but also the critics.
Yeah, I mean, so because what I was observing was obviously, the people that are attracted to blockchain come from a variety of different backgrounds. I mean, it's really attracted a lot of people from across different political spectrums, and across different kinds of political cultures and histories. And so to me, it just seemed like, although I think like some of the criticisms that have come that does analyze, especially things like Bitcoin and so on, as a kind of right-wing capitalist kind of project, or a narco-capitalist project. Sure, there's certain truths to that, but it just didn't seem to be telling the entire story, and it was telling a very kind of U.S.-centric history of blockchain to analyze it just on those terms. And I was trying to understand what else was going on, or what was missing from that picture. Because I was observing people really from lots of different political backgrounds getting involved. And so for me, it was more interesting to look at the kind of like history of decentralization and peer-to-peer, and look at some of the kind of practical problems that different technologies have been trying to solve. And one of them, I mean, really, like the kind of history of peer-to-peer in terms of network cultures really has been about authority. And it really has been about how can we create networks that even if like one person gets arrested or one server gets taken down, the network itself can still continue to function and can still continue to operate. And these were kind of pragmatic problems, that the piracy movement or anti-copyright movement has been dealing with. These are problems that like, different kind of, indie media type projects have been dealing with. It's really this question of, or this, let's say, using decentralization as a way to circumvent authorities, but what for me was interesting was some things have changed from the early history of peer-to-peer to where we're now at with blockchain technology. And a lot of that has to do with kind of like a shift in understanding, where instead of using peer-to-peer or decentralization as a kind of specific strategy for specific political projects or purposes, it becomes a kind of abstract political aim in itself. And that's where I think like this idea or this kind of illusion of like having resolved the problem of the political in some kind of final manner comes about, right? And it's also where, to be honest, I think like, by abstracting these things, that's why you see something like Ethereum being able to appeal to, financial industries plus governments plus activists plus, pretty much anybody or anything, because this thing has been taken out of it, right? It becomes this kind of like generalized abstract thing where there's no, the kind of political project is abstracted, let's say. So everyone can see a certain kind of way of potentially using these technologies for some efficiency gains or whatever else. But for me, there's like something strange that happens with that abstraction, where a kind of grounded understanding of what's in operation when the technology is lost. And what I'm trying to do in the thesis is give, some access points to that.
And actually, it feels as if a specific type of looking at the world is actually generalized. And when I was reading your thesis, I had to think about like how, or it reminded me of how game theory was invented in the socio-political arena of Cold War politics in a very specific context. And then it kind of got generalized as well, kind of similar to the way that Ethereum kind of set the scene to generalize this very specific understanding that comes out of decentralized security modeling, actually. And I was wondering, because I mean, that might be unfair again, but kind of it felt as if the same type of paranoia-ish looking on the world is generalized in game theory in the first place, and then a technology like Ethereum comes along and kind of builds a technological infrastructure to generalize it in technical terms as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, there's a whole set of kind of strange contradictions at play here. So you're right. I mean, what I'm tracing in my PhD also is like the set of problems that come about when you create a decentralized network. The set of technical problems, which, in terms of network security, is this issue that in a truly decentralized network, anyone can potentially be an adversary, right? And so, a lot of that idea of like how do you secure against the fact that anyone can potentially be an adversary does feed into a kind of like general understanding of the world. Really, is like, we're trying to eliminate trust, trying to solve the trust problem, which is like, how big or how blockchain tends to be understood these days. But it's like very fuzzy, the exact limits to where things are being solved or what's being solved here exactly, because in each and every moment there's so much trust involved. You've got to, there's no one that has actually gone through and audited every single piece of code or understood every single piece of cryptographic hashing algorithm that's being used and verified it themselves as a single individual. There are obviously communities of trust in a real sense, even in blockchain technologies, in so-called trustless networks. So like, yeah, there is this kind of imagination or this ideal that like the ultimate system is a system where nobody needs to be trusted. And that's kind of necessary to reach this ideal of a secure, decentralized system replacing authorities. But in actual fact, the way it plays out doesn't quite look that way. There's a kind of reconfiguration of how trust operates. There was something else I wanted to say on that, but it slipped my mind now. I'm sure it'll come up in a different form.
Well, yeah, and I think I'll have a good point to get into it because you describe 4 principles of blockchain technology, and afterwards you have a short paragraph where you let the reader know how different the way the terms are being used actually is. I mean, you just said it in relation to trust, but actually it's in relation to decentralization as well and consensus and stuff. So could you maybe explain the 4 principles and how the way these terms are being used is actually quite counterintuitive to the way we use it in like everyday language?
Yeah. So I guess, what I'm saying in this section is try to kind of compare, like you say, how we understand some of these terms, trust, openness, decentralization, and immutability, quite differently in our social lives than what becomes technically articulated, and how that technical articulation then becomes a kind of certain view of the world or a certain kind of understanding of the world. So, generally speaking, in social life, more trust is a good thing, right? If we create kind of more trust between us, that's a good thing. Whereas, in kind of blockchain, trust is considered something that needs to be eliminated entirely. And in some ways, like there's some interesting dynamics that I don't think I go into so much in this paragraph about that, but about how, that's in many ways a kind of feature of lots of different aspects of technology and scientific devices in general, that like we trust the observation of a device, of a measuring device, more than we would trust someone's account of it. So like, to take like temperature measurements, for example, it's like someone's like, oh, this feels really, really hot, and it's like, no, the thermometer says it's only 20 degrees outside, or things like this, where there's like a certain kind of, we assign a certain kind of validity to the return of certain kinds of technical instruments and apparatuses, more so than our kind of common experiences. That's not to pit the kind of human against the machine in any kind of way. It's just an observation about how, devices and apparatuses sometimes operate. And I say it only because, like, it's such a major, major part of the political proposition of blockchain, to create a kind of governance apparatus, essentially, that is somehow constructed by a set of elements that are beyond the control of human beings. And that's like the explicit aim. That's the political aim of the project, really.
So let's go into that. What's the role of algorithmic governance in blockchain technology? So what is the narrative around it, and what are the narratives of future that are connected to it?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understand entirely the question. If you can make it a bit more specific.
Because yeah, well, you kind of said right now that that one of the main purposes of blockchain technology is being a technology for governance purposes, in order to provide a different way to actually organize society as a whole. And there's a narrative, a political narrative connected to this technology that is tightly coupled to the idea of algorithmic governance. What's the idea behind it? How do they want to use algorithmic governance to reorganize society?
One point that I've been making a lot throughout my thesis, in the kind of, not just in the written piece, but also in the talks that I've been giving and so on, is this kind of irony, or this kind of this observation that, like, peer-to-peer technology, there's a lot of focus on this ambition of disintermediation, right? To get rid of the kind of intermediary, the middleman, so that we can have kind of direct relations with one another. And so for transactions, that would be like, let's get rid of the banks and the governments so that we can just exchange value directly between each other without anyone, either controlling whether we can do that or not, or like the surveillance and gathering information about us and our transactions. And so there's like this focus on disintermediation and getting rid of the middleman. But then on this kind of like political ambition, you look at this thing and it's like the most incredible, like the most intense form of intermediation you can imagine when it comes to questions of governance, right? We're bringing together like, networks and algorithms and protocols, and game theory and market dynamics and you name it, all into this kind of like some kind of apparatus that is supposed to kind of sit between all of us, and enforce some kind of consensus between all of us. So it's this very intense form of intermediation, actually, and a hugely complex form of intermediation. So on the question of algorithmic governance, with blockchain, I think I mentioned already in the definition how, the technology looks to solve the problem of the political. And so you have, something like, you have consensus algorithms that organize consensus amongst nodes in the network. But also, you've got things like decentralized autonomous organizations. You've got things like smart contracts. So ways of trying to kind of automate certain aspects of governance and contractual relationships, let's say, so that they once again cannot be controlled by any single individual, but that run across a kind of decentralized network. And there's lots of kind of directions that people imagine this going in. So the kind of like fantasy, which is both the kind of like dystopian fantasy, but also something that you see people in the blockchain space talk about with like really kind of like feverish bright eyes, is this this combination of blockchain with AI, that will have AI emerge, which will be this kind of like perfect, scary, non-human, but amazingly mathematical intelligence that will use the kind of power of cryptography and the kind of uncontrollability, unstoppability of smart contracts to basically run the world.
And specifically in terms of this narrative for future, there has been some setbacks, to say it mildly. Mm-hmm. So there was a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, as you mentioned, in Ethereum, on the Ethereum blockchain. And there was a lot of hype around it. And at some point it got hacked. And actually what followed then was some kind of reflection about the limits of this kind of thinking, and for some it was like I think it was just the lesson that we just didn't do it good enough yet. Yeah. And for others, they thought, all right, well, this showed us actually that it's not just a deterministic world we're living in that can be handled in this kind of way, but there are different aspects like social aspects and stuff that have to be considered in this kind of thing.
Yeah, so I write quite a bit about that event in my thesis also. I mean, the problem is, so the story of blockchain and what it can do, and the story of blockchain plus AI, these things, they sound so convincing. But one of the main reasons why they're so convincing is because when you look at the story, you're looking only at the story and you forget to look at everything outside of it, when actually everything outside of it really matters for how that story will play out in reality. And to take a very basic example, this idea of a kind of blockchain system that runs entirely without authorities. At some point, someone had to write that protocol, right? and so that someone, or those groups of people, in essence, have then written the rules of society, right? If indeed this thing was going to continue to run without it being controlled or without it being kind of modified and so on. But also what happens is, in reality, not only has someone or people writing protocols, but also the protocols need to be maintained and updated, and things break and nothing is ever written perfectly. And, so there is this kind of like real kind of difference or real gap between the kind of the perfect ideal that somehow kind of, mathematics, cryptography, and technical systems, they give us this kind of mental image of something that is perfectly neatly organized, perfectly rational, and perfectly objective, when in actual fact, like, it's a mental image of it. Whenever people actually write these things down, obviously, like, it exists as part of a kind of far more complex world, where lots of other dynamics play into how a system will actually operate and the actual effects of a system. And so what happened in the DAO attack was, there was this decentralized autonomous organization, And it was supposed to be governed purely and only by the rules written in its smart contract. And this smart contract lived in a decentralized network, and no one was supposed to be able to modify it or change it after it had been deployed. So it was deployed, and lots of people invested in the decentralized autonomous organization. I think up to $60 million. No, more than that. I think over $100 million. And then all of a sudden, people saw that there was an amount of investment that was being taken out of the DAO contract repeatedly. And so it turned out that in the contract code, this was possible through a kind of combination of a couple different rules that had been specified in the contract. And someone was literally emptying the fund and got away with about $60 million. And the reactions to that were, kind of split the community. So some people felt like, this needed to be stopped. This should never have happened. We should intervene. And another set of people were like, no, because the rules said that only the smart contracts governs this thing. And so therefore, if what's written in the smart contract is the only thing that governs it, and it allows for this person to actually, or this hacker to actually siphon off this money, that should be allowed to go ahead. And so what you saw was, the Ethereum Foundation got quite concerned and got involved, because this was a considerable amount of the actual total amount of Ether in the market. And so they decided to go in and intervene and basically do what's called, I guess you could call it a kind of rollback on the Ethereum blockchain and fork the blockchain so that before the hack attacked, and kind of pretend that in the history of the Ethereum blockchain, this hack had never actually happened, to then buy time to go in and retrieve the funds. And that's like a clear act of a kind of outside authority in a sense, right? And so there was a lot of like soul searching in the community about whether or not that was a good thing or not, whether that should be possible at all. And it did split the community, and so you have two different versions of Ethereum running now. One that has a history of events where this hack never happened, and one that has a history of events where it did happen. And I guess, and so for some people in the Ethereum community, the way of making sense of this, in terms of decentralization and so on, was to say that social consensus trumps computational consensus. So this idea that like it was actually okay for the Ethereum Foundation to step in and retrieve the funds by forking the chain, because there was broad agreement in the community that was what needed to be done. And that agreement was expressed through the adoption of nodes in the network of this new version of the Ethereum blockchain. So, in many ways, you could say there was a decentralized consensus around moving forward on that decision. Although there was a kind of another splinter group that disagreed. So there's lots of stuff going on here. But what I think really kind of was very nicely kind of demonstrated to the community was that you don't get rid of the complexity of the world. You don't get rid of human beings. You don't get rid of all these things so easily, and they actually play a pretty important role for how systems play out. Like there's no final guarantee against against the indeterminate reality that we live in. Things kind of unfold. I mean, yeah, there's so many ways of kind of saying this, and I keep saying it, that this idea of a kind of final solution to the problem of the political, it's cute, and I understand where it's coming from, but really, cryptography doesn't do that. There is nothing that does that. I mean, time keeps passing, and between us, there's just too many there's too many unknowns in the universe. It's like it's a radically open future, you know. And you take something like cryptography that is really, let's say, the cornerstone of this political, or this kind of belief system in blockchain. This idea of like the security of cryptography being like something fixed and something determined that, you know, that we can somehow build everything else on top of. You know, I went to Bletchley Park the other day, which is I don't know if people know what that is, but it's where Alan Turing and a bunch of other English mathematicians got together during the Second World War to break the German Lorentz cipher machine. And a few of them did, and invented the Colossus in order to do that. And it's, you know, it's a very kind of historical reminder and an epic reminder of the fact that cryptography, you know, is never final. You know, it can be broken, and it is repeatedly broken, and it's an ongoing process. Cryptography is very interesting to use in different kinds of systems design, because yes, it does buy you time, and it has some incredible properties, but it doesn't resolve things in any final way. It's not bulletproof. It's just another device that we humans have invented in our engagement with the kind of elements of the universe that we live in. You know, with the mathematics that we've kind of developed. Yeah. That was a lot.
Don't mind. That's good. And actually, there's another element that kind of undermines this perception of blockchain technology being a truth machine. In your thesis, there's a part where you describe this actually quite fitting. I'll just quote it, actually. I think if we take a closer look at how double spending is solved and how consensus is arrived at in decentralized networks, there is in fact no need to determine which of the conflicting transactions is true, because from the perspective of the system, it does not matter which is verified as long as it is just one of them. What is true or really happened is not of importance, end quote. So I really like that, because the consensus, this means that the consensus in blockchain is actually far from being any kind of objective truth, but it is what you later call an incentive-driven settlement. And I think this is very spot on, because it kind of begs the question, how does this affect the kinds of truths? Is that the plural of truth? I don't know. The truths that can be produced, because I'm actually like 100% sure that there are many truths that cannot be produced with this specific type of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, it's another kind of like cute. I say cute because, yeah, it's another kind of cute approach to some of the kind of deep, complex problems of the political. And I say cute because it's a kind of backing down of, or a kind of historical accumulation of disappointments in authorities. So it feels a little bit like this child who realizes that its parents are fallible, you know, and goes looking for something that isn't fallible. And so, you know, and the reason why I say that is because, like, okay, so I don't know, to me it does seem like, you know, it's trying to, instead of trying to ponder what, you know, truths might be out there and try and work through that in all the kind of philosophical implications and all the social implications and through all the kind of historical pain and so on that has happened in this pursuit of truth. And I'm talking about religion, I'm talking about political ideologies, I'm talking about geopolitics, you know, and historical events. This is the kind of idea that, like, we don't need a universal truth stemming from kind of human reflection. All we need is something that ensures that who gets to determine the next round of truth is randomly selected in a way that can be deterministically analyzed as decentralized, as fair. There's no single node in the network that will be able to determine the truth over and over and over again. It's always going to be a different node in the network. So it's this kind of mathematically randomized set of truths. And there's some, so when we talk about truth machine, or this idea of blockchain as truth machine, that is the kind of truth that's being produced. And this is again a little bit of an abstraction, because we're analyzing, proof of work. And so the truth that we're talking about here is whether a transaction happened or not, in, the Bitcoin blockchain or whatever. And so it's a bit of an extrapolation to talk about kind of more existential or political truths. But I do think that extrapolation makes sense, because that is the kind of ultimate political imaginary that's at play here in blockchain. But yeah, it's a very particular kind of and strange and funky and quite interesting way of arriving at a set of truths. And I'm sure that I am curious about the experiments in this space, to see what and how we might be able to use something like this. But I'm also quite firm about finding the very specific appropriate uses of it, and really not having this as some kind of overarching ideology. Because like you say, this form of consensus, this method at which to arrive at consensus around truths is a very specific way. It's very different from, let's say, a group of people that get together in a room and share their experiences about something, that then arrive at some kind of shared understanding of what has happened. That's a very, very different process, and a very, very different way of being in the world and acting in the world and understanding the world, than the proof of work consensus algorithm, right?
Actually, I'm keen on looking a bit closer on this subset of being incentive driven, because I think that's quite relevant, and you can see this in other fields as well. When, for example, a blockchain technology has to resolve the problem how to bridge the gap into the material world, like the non-digital world, then things come into play like oracles and stuff. Yeah. But these oracles, they are market driven. So it's then a monetary incentive that is supposed to deliver the best possible truth, not the ultimate truth, maybe, yeah. But it's like constructed as if this monetary incentive is able to produce the best workable truth. And I think this goes down to the bottom of the protocol when it comes to something like crypto economics, because there also you have this kind of techno-engineering idea, or behavioral engineering idea, you call it, I think, in the thesis as well, that you might be able to construct a good system architecture through actually carrots and sticks, which are, again, monetary incentives or the punishment of taking away some money.
Yeah, exactly. And there again, it's interesting to look at how things are done or might be done differently in a social scenario, right? So, when we're working with crypto economic designs, then it is very much, like you say, kind of crude carrot or stick kind of set of tools that are being used. Yeah,
maybe,
sorry, go ahead.
I think, and maybe for the listeners, could you briefly explain what it is, crypto economics, what that means?
Yeah. And it won't be brief. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
because I think, again, there's an interesting alternative history that hasn't really been discussed or written much about crypto economics. But crypto economics basically comes from, in the Bitcoin protocol, what you have is a set of miners in the network that verify transactions, and those miners are rewarded with some Bitcoin every time they successfully manage to verify a block of transactions. And they're rewarded with a Bitcoin partially with the idea that if it pays more to contribute to the system than it does to attack it, then you'll have a system that essentially, it's a kind of element of the security of the system. You'll have a system that runs well, and so you get even more kind of sophisticated versions of that you kind of economically reward good behavior in the network, and economically punish bad behavior in the network. And you see kind of different designs of that in different protocols in the blockchain space, and some of them get very elaborate. And I used the Bitcoin example because it's kind of one of the kind of more simple ones and easier to understand. So yeah, it's a kind of combination of game theory and market dynamics in a kind of cryptographic decentralized network space. But the other story to that I think is a very interesting angle is to understand this in terms of business models. Because if we take, the kind of business models of platform, the kind of like internet platforms of today that use a kind of data extraction as their business models, data extraction and advertising. If we want to create new kind of a new type of internet, Web3, and if we want to create kind of new types of decentralized applications that make it cryptographically impossible for the kind of business models that rely on data extraction in that kind of a way, then we need a different kind of economy that runs these systems. And so for me, the interesting side of crypto economics, the really interesting side of crypto economics, is the dream of and the idea of creating systems that are kind of economically autonomous and viable to run without the need for surveillance or surveillance capitalism or platform surveillance or the kinds of business models that we see run the internet today. So that for me is like the kind of opportunity, the interesting possibility of crypto economics.
Awesome. I think it's really, really important to point that out because, I mean, also for someone like me, it's kind of like overwhelming how the way crypto economics is handled is narrowed down to this idea of actually socio-technical engineering, which I think is really behavioral engineering, which I think is really actually a very dangerous road to go on, and it's very refreshing the way you did describe it right now, that there are also, this might be a like acute danger to use the technology in the way of behavioral engineering or such. There are these other possibilities to actually use the technology in a way that is very much beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, but I think like in order for that to actually be able to happen, the space needs a lot of new thinking, especially from people that come from heterodox economic thinking, because like right now what you've got is a bunch of programmers and computer engineers tinkering with economic tools. And so, and from their perspective, they're trying to achieve certain security properties in the network. And so economics is being used in order to achieve those security properties. And that's why it tends towards behavioral engineering. That's why it tends towards like, how can we kind of make sure that certain types of behaviors, honest behavior happens, whereas kind of dishonest or malicious behavior is made impossible, So that's like, it's really the computer engineer's perspective. But if we can have kind of more thinking in this space that looks more at this question of, the business model of the internet and the kinds of economics that might happen in that space, if we can kind of start deliberately shaping that in some ways, I think that would be like super interesting. I think that's like, an important direction to work on.
Very much so. But I have to say, I think it's in the current state, it's not just that the programmers are thinking in terms of security models, and that's why there's this kind of misunderstanding. But I'm afraid that I think what's happening right now, and you can see that in the collaboration between Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, and Glenn Whale, an economist who wrote Radical Markets. What the next level shit in this sense is that they are very much aware of that this is not just about security modeling, but they believe crypto economics to be the appropriate social technology to design society. That's the impression I get, and that for me means that there might be a lesson learned in terms of how autonomous systems are not fully controllable, and that we should put some social input into how to govern things and stuff like that, to say just a bit simple. But that in the final step, there's still a belief in engineering society through appropriate technological architectures. Actually, they really call it. He calls it the new social technology, like crypto economics.
Yeah, and this is where I think it's important to understand power a little bit better. And different forms of power, because, in the blockchain space, and I think in society in general, when people kind of think of power just off the top of their heads, what comes to mind is a kind of authoritarian dictator, right? What comes to mind is like a kind of centralized, some kind of centralized power where, one person or one party or whatever determines everything, and kind of power radiates from that kind of central point. But there's so many more theories of power and ways of understanding power that are much more kind of apt at describing our current kind of conditions. One of which, like in the case of what you just described, that is quite useful for understanding this condition is like a kind of power that operates more on the landscape of what's possible. So instead of having a centralized person dictate, what needs to happen, you kind of model the landscape in a way that makes certain types of things seem like they're just naturally impossible to do or very difficult to do, and make other things feel like they're very desirable to do. And that's what a lot of kind of protocological design really is about. And that's what a lot of kind of crypto economic design really is about, is, to kind of make certain types of behavior desirable for someone on a kind of intuitive level. So it doesn't feel like an authority is dictating anything to you. It's just the way the landscape looks. It's easier to go that, down that road than it is to climb over that hedge, And so, I think keeping an eye on that is very important. Also to be able to analyze, analyze what is the types of, what is the politics that's being inscribed in the protocols that then shape that landscape, Yeah.
What's the main takeaway from your research?
Oh, wow. The main takeaway. Give me one moment, because there's so many that we've touched on. What's the main takeaway for you?
I think it's that we should all be aware that there is no wholesale answer to anything, actually, and that these things are like context specific, and that they have like a side that might benefit us, that is very much context specific, but another one that is not, and we shouldn't like alles über einen Kamm scheren. I don't know the English word for that. Like, we shouldn't approach it as if it's all the same. Take a second look. Maybe that's
yeah. I think you're right. I mean, really, that is the main takeaway. The main takeaway is, or the main kind of the main work that I'm trying to do here is to, first of all, shift the understanding away from trying to arrive at some final solutions to problems of power and politics and these issues, and to create some ways to feel okay about the fact that we do live in an infinitely complex world and universe, where the work is ongoing, and that's part of the excitement of things, right? These new technologies can do incredible things. History doesn't stop. The work doesn't stop. The game doesn't stop. The kind of interaction. I mean, there's so much more interesting things to come. And all this stuff will break and get old, at some point. And we'll move on and something else will happen. And it's really kind of tracing through and sticking, there's just a fantastic title of a book by Donna Haraway that came out last year, staying with the trouble, that's what it's about. And I say this not as a kind of like trying to create some kind of new universal statement, but more like literally staying with the trouble, and understanding the details of how these technologies play out and getting involved in how they play out,
Great final words. I usually put one question at the end, which is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
If I think about the future, what makes it that the future is radically open. The future has never been more radically open than it feels right now, and that to me is incredible.
Awesome. Jaya, thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you, Jan.